England has food banks, England has council housing, housing benefit, a welfare state assembled over the last 100 years and argued about every single week. And most people assume that's where charity for the poor begins, that it's modern, that before the 20th century, if you were old and poor and had nowhere to go, you simply went without. That assumption is wrong, and the proof is sitting in the middle of ordinary English towns, hiding in plain sight, often mistaken for a church. Centuries before the welfare state existed, before income tax, before the word charity meant a registered organisation with a logo, a bishop or a wool merchant or a duchess would do something very specific. They would write into their will, house the poor on this ground, feed them, shelter them, forever. They would set aside the land and the money to pay for it, and then they would die. And here is the part nobody quite processes. That instruction is still being obeyed, not commemorated, not displayed behind glass with an information board. Obeyed. Somewhere in England this morning, someone who owns almost nothing unlocked the door of a home that no one can ever take away from them, because a stranger, dead for 500, 600, 800 years, made certain of it in writing. These places are called almshouses. They are the oldest form of social housing in Britain, older than the country's idea of itself as a single nation. Around 1,600 almshouse charities still operate across the United Kingdom today, housing roughly 37,000 people. Most of them date from the last few centuries, but a small number are genuinely ancient, and a smaller number still are running, right now, on rules written by hand on parchment by people who saw the medieval world as the present day. This list covers 8 of them, ranked from remarkable to almost impossible to believe. By entry 1, the idea that social housing was invented in the 20th century is going to feel less like a fact and more like something you were sold. Because the thread running through every one of these places is the same uncomfortable question. What does it mean for a promise to outlive every single person who made it, every government that taxed it, every war that should have ended it, and still be kept? Let's begin. Entry 8, Bond's Hospital, Coventry Hill Street, in the centre of Coventry, behind the Church of St John the Baptist, inside what was once the line of the medieval city wall. You reach it through a stone archway, and on the far side is a quiet quadrangle of timber and stone that the modern city seems to have simply forgotten to demolish. Bond's Hospital was founded in 1506 by Thomas Bond, a wealthy draper who had served as mayor of Coventry. He left money in his will for the upkeep of 10 poor men and a woman to look after them. That much is documented. The detail that tells you what kind of world this was comes from his statutes. Bond did not give the poor men a home for nothing. Every one of them received a black gown each year, and in return they were required to attend Mass daily, and every evening, after supper, to kneel in the church and recite a fixed set of prayers, for the soul of Thomas Bond, for his ancestors, and for all Christian souls. Then they were permitted to drink and go to bed. This is the engine underneath the oldest almshouses, and you have to understand it to understand all of them. In medieval belief, the soul of a dead man could be helped through purgatory by the prayers of the living, so a rich man could, in effect, hire the poor to pray him into heaven. He housed them. They prayed for him. The almshouse was a machine that converted money into shelter, into prayer, into salvation. The residents had a word for themselves, beadsmen, from bead, an old word for prayer. Whether those prayers worked is not something history can verify. What history can verify is the building, the will, and the fact that it never stopped. Bond's Hospital was heavily restored in the 1830s and 40s after a period of neglect, and that's precisely why it sits at number 8. More of its fabric has been rebuilt than at the places higher on this list. But the function never broke. Bond's Hospital is still charitable housing today, now home to dozens of residents across the original almshouse and newer buildings around it. The trade-off is a strange one to sit with. Your home was, at its origin, a transaction. A man bought his way toward heaven, and you are the living half of the deal. Except the man has been dead for over 500 years, and nobody asks you to pray for him anymore. You simply get to live there. The salvation machine kept the part that mattered and quietly dropped the part that didn't. The shelter outlasted the theology. Entry 7, Abbot's Hospital, Guildford. At the top of the old High Street in Guildford, Surrey, opposite Holy Trinity Church, stands a great dark red brick gatehouse with turrets and lead domes that looks less like housing for the poor and more like the entrance to an Oxford college. That resemblance is deliberate. This is Abbot's Hospital, founded in 1619 by George Abbot, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Abbot was not born grand. He was born in Guildford, the son of a cloth worker, and he rose, through the church, through the universities, all the way to the top, becoming Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the translators of the King James Bible. And when he had wealth and power, he turned them back toward the town that made him. In his own words, he built the hospital out of love for the place of his birth, where his aged parents had lived many years. It was a home for the elderly poor of Guildford, 12 brethren in one wing, 8 sisters in the other. It is still doing exactly that. Nearly 400 years after the first residents were admitted on the founder's 60th birthday, Abbot's Hospital is a Grade 1 listed Jacobean building still providing town centre homes for around 26 elderly residents. But every place on this list carries a shadow, and Abbot's is darker than most. In 1621, while the hospital was still being completed, the Archbishop went hunting and loosed a crossbow bolt at a deer. It missed and struck and killed a gamekeeper. George Abbot, the most senior churchman in England, the man building a monument to charity in his hometown, had killed a man by accident. He received a royal pardon, but the affair haunted him for the rest of his life. His influence at court drained away, and he died a semi-retired figure in 1633. What is documented here is the killing, the pardon, and the founder's grief. What the family of stories around the place adds is the suggestion that the hospital became, in part, the act of a man trying to weigh his soul down on the right side of the scale. Whether that's true is unprovable, but it fits the pattern exactly. A building for the poor, founded by someone with a great deal to atone for. The trade-off is this. You live inside a building grander than most manor houses, in the centre of an expensive town, and it was built specifically so that the poor of Guildford would never have to be grateful to a stranger, only to a man who had once been one of them. You are housed by a guilty conscience that turned, in the end, into stone and brick and 4 centuries of kept promises. Entry 6. Lord Leycester Hospital, Warwick. Just inside the medieval west gate of Warwick, climbing up the high street, is a cluster of honey-coloured, half-timbered buildings, so leaning and ancient they look like a stage set. The chapel on the gate dates to the 1120s. The great halls and living quarters were built by Warwick's medieval guilds over the following centuries. And in 1571, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, acquired the whole complex and turned it into an almshouse for soldiers who had been, in the language of his charter, maimed or hurt in the wars in the service of the Queen. He installed a master and 12 brethren, drawn from the ranks of injured soldiers. And the remarkable thing is not just that the institution survives, it's how it survives. The master and brethren still live here. They still wear a version of the Tudor livery Dudley gave them. They still gather for worship in the chapel using words laid down centuries ago. This is, quite literally, the older and quieter forerunner of the famous Chelsea pensioners. The same idea, the wounded soldier given a dignified home for life, but begun over a century earlier. Today, there are 8 ex-servicemen and their spouses living within those leaning walls, down from the original 12 since the buildings were modernised in the 1960s. They are real residents in real homes. They are also, unavoidably, part of the spectacle, guides to the visitors, keepers of the ceremony, men in historic dress in a building people pay to walk through. The Victorians were fascinated by exactly this, by the quaint uniformed figures behind the gatehouse, and that fascination has never really stopped. What's documented is the foundation, the charter, the continuity of soldier residence for over 450 years. What's harder to pin down is everything Dudley wanted from it. Piety, certainly, but also the courtier's instinct to be seen doing good by a queen he was desperate to impress. Both things are probably true at once. The trade-off is the one every old soldier here accepts. You served your country, you were broken by it, and your reward is a home for life inside one of the most beautiful medieval buildings in England. And the cost is that you live partly as a living exhibit of yourself. Companionship, dignity, a roof that will never be taken away, and a turnstile in the courtyard. You are cared for, and you are also on display, and the same charter from 1571 is responsible for both. Entry 5. Browne's Hospital, Stamford. In the stone town of Stamford, Lincolnshire, one of the most perfectly preserved old towns in England, on Broad Street stands a building so ecclesiastical in its design that visitors regularly mistake it for one of the town's medieval churches. It isn't. It's an almshouse, and it was built by the wool trade. Browne's Hospital was founded by William Browne, one of the richest wool merchants of his age, a man who had been mayor of the staple of Calais. He built it around 1475 and obtained royal letters patent to formally endow it in the 1480s. It was a home and a house of prayer for 10 poor men and 2 poor women, overseen by a warden. The architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner called it one of the best medieval hospitals in England. The bedesmen here, like at Coventry, were required to attend chapel twice a day and to pray for the souls of William Browne and his wife Margaret. And what makes Browne's extraordinary is how much of that original world is still physically present. The building retains its medieval chapel and a set of stained glass windows considered nationally significant, late 15th century glass that the founder himself would have seen installed. Above the entrance is a statue of William Browne. The man is gone, his face still watches the door. The criteria for who could live there once mixed poverty with piety. You needed to be poor, of good character, and able to recite the Lord's Prayer. Today, the criterion is simpler. It is need. The building still provides almshouse homes for around a dozen residents, now more women than men, managed by trustees rather than priests. The trade-off is subtle. Your rent, in the founder's design, was never really money. It was prayer and good behaviour and belonging to the building's purpose. That bargain has softened over 5 centuries into something gentler, but the building still expects something of you. You don't own Browne's Hospital, you join it. You become, for a while, the latest in an unbroken line of poor men and women who have lived under that roof since before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. And when you go, the line continues without you, exactly as William Browne intended when he carved his own likeness over the gate so that he would never quite leave. And here is where the list turns. The 4 places we've seen so far were founded by the wealthy and powerful. A draper, an archbishop, an earl, a wool magnate, men buying legacy and salvation with their fortunes, building monuments that happen to keep the poor warm. That is the standard story of the almshouse, and it's a true one. But from this point forward, the foundations get older, the founders get stranger, and the instructions get more specific. We move past 500 years and into 7 and 8. We reach a building where the poor still live inside the actual medieval hall, a foundation older than the Norman Conquest. And finally a place where the founder's exact medieval order is not merely remembered, but physically performed, on demand, every single day. Watch how the distance between past and present collapses. Entry 4, Ewelme, Oxfordshire. In a small village in the Chiltern foothills south of Oxford, a stream still runs through the heart of the settlement, and a row of brick almshouses climbs the slope toward the parish church of St Mary's. They were built in 1437, and they were built by the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer. Her name was Alice de la Pole. She was the granddaughter of the poet who wrote the Canterbury Tales, the daughter of a Speaker of the House of Commons, and through her marriage to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, one of the great heiresses of 15th century England. In 1437, with a royal licence from King Henry VI, Alice and her husband founded what they called God's House at Ewelme, a community of 13 poor men and 2 priests, alongside a school. The almshouses survive, they are still occupied, and the school beside them is the oldest non-fee-paying school in the country to have remained in continuous use. That is a beautiful story. The detail underneath it is not. The almsmen of God's house were required to be forever on their knees, praying for the souls of the founders, their pay docked if they were absent or misbehaved. And inside the church, you can see exactly who they were praying for. Alice de la Pole's tomb is one of the most extraordinary objects in any English church, an alabaster monument that shows her twice. On top, she lies serene and richly dressed, a great lady in death. But beneath, behind a screen of stone tracery, the same woman is carved a second time, as a withered, decaying corpse. It is called a cadaver tomb, and it is a medieval meditation on the certainty that all flesh rots, no matter how high you rise. So the almsman knelt and prayed for the soul of a duchess whose own monument depicted her as a corpse beneath a roof she had paid for. The continuity here is verifiable. The 1437 licence, the surviving buildings, the tomb you can still walk up to and look at. The literary glow, the Chaucer connection, is the thing the village now carries forever, the reason coaches stop. The trade-off is unsettling and exact. You live inside one woman's personal machinery for cheating death. The home that shelters you was built so that the poor would pray her soul to safety, and she reminds anyone who enters her church that she knew, even at the height of her power, that she would one day be the corpse in the lower half of her own tomb. Your comfort was the down payment on her eternity. And nearly 600 years later, the eternity is unproven, but the home is still standing and someone is still living in it. Entry 3. St Mary's Hospital, Chichester. Off St Martin's Square, in the northeast corner of the cathedral city of Chichester in West Sussex, there is a long building with an enormous timber-framed roof, a roof of 60,000 handmade clay tiles sloping down toward walls only a few feet high. From a nearby car park, you can see the medieval roofline rising above the rooftops, and underneath it, people live. You need to slow down for this one, because it is genuinely close to unbelievable. St Mary's Hospital has existed on this site since the late 13th century. Written statutes survive from between 1232 and 1248, which means the institution is older than the building it now occupies. In the Middle Ages, hospitals like this one were built to a standard design across Europe. One long hall used as an infirmary, with a chapel at the eastern end, all under a single roof. Almost every one of them has vanished. Apart from a smaller survivor in Lübeck, in Germany, St Mary's is essentially the last of its kind. And here is the part that separates it from every other entry. Most ancient almshouses survive as a shell, with modern flats built inside or alongside. At St Mary's, residents still live within the original medieval hall itself. The vast 13th century infirmary, where the sick and the poor were once laid in rows, was divided in the 17th century into small flats with fireplaces, and people live in them to this day. The carved oak screen between the hall and the chapel is original. The roof above their heads was likely completed before 1300. Across the medieval building and newer accommodation nearby, St Mary's is home to around 40 residents who live independently with the support of a chaplain and a scheme manager and are still invited to morning prayers. What's documented is overwhelming and physical: the statutes, the screen, the roof, the building type. What's debated is only the very beginning, exactly who founded it and precisely when the first community gathered here to care for the sick and the wayfarer. The trade-off is almost philosophical. You don't live in a building that used to be a medieval hospital. You live in the medieval hospital, the actual hall, the last one. Every morning you wake up inside a structure that science has dated to the 13th century, doing the exact thing it was raised to do, sheltering people who need shelter. There is no replica here, no recreation. The continuity isn't a story told about the place. It is the place, still warm, still occupied, still working. Entry 2. Hospital of St Oswald, Worcester. In the city of Worcester stands a foundation so old that to give its date is to step almost out of recorded English history. The Hospital of St Oswald is thought to have been founded around the year 990. It is widely regarded as the oldest almshouse foundation still in existence in England. Sit with that year for a moment. 990. This was Anglo-Saxon England, the Norman Conquest. The event most people treat as the beginning of Old English history would not happen for another 76 years. There was no Tower of London, no Westminster Abbey as we know it, no English nation in the modern sense. England was a patchwork still consolidating, still raided by Vikings. And in the middle of all of that, a charitable foundation was established in Worcester to shelter the poor and the sick. It has never stopped existing. This is where you have to be careful, because the honest version is more interesting than the exaggerated one. The stone you see at St Oswald's today is not the stone of the year 990. The buildings have been rebuilt many times over 1,000 years. What has survived is not the fabric but the foundation, the continuous charitable institution, the endowment, the legal and human chain of an organisation that has been housing the needy of Worcester since before the millennium. The institution is the relic, not the masonry. That distinction is exactly what separates careful history from a tourist brochure, and St Oswald's deserves the careful version. And once you hold that distinction, the scale of it lands. Every other foundation on this list, Coventry, Guildford, Warwick, Stamford, Ewelme, even 13th century Chichester, was established within an institution at Worcester that was already centuries old. When the wool merchant William Browne was carving his statue over a door in Stamford, St Oswald's had already been sheltering the poor for nearly 500 years. The trade-off here is one of humility rather than hardship. To live within a charity this old is to be a single recent link in a chain that stretches back past nearly everything we call English history. Your tenancy is measured in years. The thing that houses you is measured in 1,000. You are passing through something that was ancient when the Normans landed and will, in all likelihood, still be doing its quiet work long after your name is forgotten. Entry 1. The Hospital of St Cross, Winchester. 1 mile south of the centre of Winchester, in Hampshire, set in water meadows beside the River Itchen, is a complex of medieval stone buildings around 2 courtyards that has been described simply as England's oldest and most perfect almshouse. This is the Hospital of St Cross, and it is the place where the entire idea behind this list stops being history and becomes something you can witness with your own eyes. It was founded between 1132 and 1136 by Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, grandson of William the Conqueror and brother of a king. He established it to house 13 poor men too frail to work and to feed 100 more at its gates every single day. According to the founding legend, Henry was walking by the Itchen meadows when a starving peasant girl begged him to help the local families during the brutal Civil War, then tearing England apart. Whether that meeting ever happened, no one can say. Historians are honest about it. It could have happened, given the suffering of the time, but it cannot be proven. What can be proven is that Henry founded the hospital in the 1130s and that it has continued, in one form or another, for nearly 900 years. Today, 25 elderly men, the brothers, live there permanently, and on certain days you can see them moving about the courtyards in long gowns of black or red. That alone would earn St Cross a place near the top of any list like this. But it is not what puts it at number 1. What puts it at number 1 is a small medieval order that is still being physically carried out, today, on demand, to total strangers. It is called the Wayfarer's Dole, founded in the spirit of a monk from Cluny in France, whose religious order always gave bread and wine to travellers. The custom at St Cross is this. Any person who walks up to the porter's lodge and asks for the dole is handed a small horn of ale and a morsel of bread, for free, because they asked. Just as a medieval pilgrim on the road to Canterbury would have been nearly 9 centuries ago, and it still happens. You can do it. You can travel to Winchester, walk through the water meadows, knock at the lodge of a building founded by the grandson of William the Conqueror, ask for the Wayfarer's Dole, and a person will hand you bread and ale, fulfilling an instruction that has been running, unbroken, since the 1130s. That is the whole point of this video, compressed into a single act. At every other place on this list, the founder's intention is preserved, kept, honoured, maintained. At St Cross, the founder's intention is not preserved. It is performed. It is a living verb. A medieval order to feed the traveller at the gate is not a memory here. It is a thing that happens to a stranger who knocks this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon and the one after that. The trade-off, if you can even call it that, is the weight of standing inside something that refuses to become the past. The brothers who live at St Cross are not curators of a dead tradition. They are the current custodians of a promise that is 890 years old and still, somehow, being kept by hand, 1 cup of ale at a time. Why are they still here? So that's the list. But it leaves the harder question, the one worth sitting with. If these 8 places survived, why did so many others fail? Because there were once far more. By the middle of the 16th century, England had something like 800 of these foundations, and then a great deal of it was destroyed, not by war, not by fire, but by a single act of state. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII tore through the religious institutions that ran much of England's charity. Many almshouses were tied to that world, and they were sold off, stripped, or left to fall into ruin. The medieval network of care for the poor was gutted in a generation. So the survival of these 8 is not the normal outcome, it is the exception. And when you look at why each one made it, there's no single mechanism, but there is a single thread. Bond's Hospital survived because a merchant tied his own salvation to the shelter of the poor, and the shelter outlasted the belief. Abbot survived because a guilty archbishop poured his fortune back into the town that raised him. Lord Leycester survived because injured soldiers kept living and serving inside it for 4.5 centuries. Browne survived because a wool merchant built so well and endowed so carefully that need alone could keep it going. Ewelme survived inside one woman's bargain with death. Chichester survived as the last of its entire architectural species. Worcester survived as a foundation older than the Conquest. And St Cross survived because century after century, someone kept walking to the porter's lodge to hand bread to a stranger. What every one of them shares is this. In every generation, somebody decided that the original instruction still mattered, that the will of a person 800 years dead was worth obeying, that the poor of the town should still be housed on this exact ground for this exact reason, even when the theology had faded, even when the money was hard, even when it would have been so much easier to sell the land and let the building become a museum. We like to imagine the medieval past as the cruel age and ourselves as the compassionate present, that kindness toward the poor is something we invented, something modern and enlightened. But stand in any of these 8 courtyards and the truth quietly inverts. The compassion is the old part. The instruction to shelter the poor forever was written down centuries before any of us were born. We are not the authors of it. We are only the latest people who chose to keep the promise. Somewhere in England this morning, someone who owns almost nothing unlocked the door of a home that no one can ever take from them. And the only reason that door opened is that a stranger, long dead, decided it should, and that everyone in between agreed. If you've ever walked past an almshouse without knowing what it was, that odd little row of cottages around a courtyard, that building in your town that looks like a church but isn't, tell me in the comments. Name it. I want to map the ones that are still running, still keeping a promise older than the country itself. And if this showed you something about England you didn't have before, consider subscribing. We cover the history that surface-level content skips, not because it's obscure, but because it only means something if you sit with it long enough to understand what it actually is. A promise kept by hand for 800 years.